latest event, and today's guest is Anand Menon. Anand is Professor of European Politics and Foreign Affairs at King's College London. He is also Director of UK in a Changing Europe, which is a non-partisan project that provides impartial information, insights and analysis about the UK-EU relations, both in the run-up to Brexit and its aftermath. I think certainly for my own purposes, but I know it's more broadly thought that in what was a highly politicised and heated and often misrepresented debate, that the organisation was of huge value as a research outfit and a truth seeker as well. So as one of the country's foremost commentators, I call him the leader of the AC Pack, which I just coined today, the academic pack, on Twitter especially. But Anand has become a leading public figure and has been a regular on BBC Question Time, though I'm told he combs his hair for Question Time, among many other programmes, and he's also a regular on the op-ed pages. So today we shall explore the journey to Brexit, its impact on the UK as a whole, and Scotland a bit in particular, both in terms of challenges and opportunities, the country's future political and economic relationship with the EU, and also our wider global prospects. So just a little reminder to mute yourself if you aren't me or Anand, and if you're allowed to ask a question, then I'll unmute you at that point. And as usual, can you send your questions via the Zoom messaging button, and I'll make sure you get a chance to put them to Anand once I've finished with him. So Anand, welcome.
Very much indeed.
Congratulations on your institution building with UK and a Changing Europe. I have to say its success has been met with some surprise. Our mutual friend Stuart Wood asks how you reformed your ways since your incompetent leadership of the JCR at University College, Oxford.
Well, I think the answer to that is that the success of UK and a Changing Europe has very little to do with my leadership and an awful lot to do with circumstance.
Well, it has certainly worked a treat. Let's start with the Brexit campaign. Looking back now, a few years out, I guess, and certainly some months out from having actually left, how would you characterise the quality of that debate, the approach taken by both sides, how well informed the electorate truly was before people cast their vote?
I mean, there are several things. I mean, it was a political campaign, and political campaigns are, of course, by definition and by volition, far from perfect from the point of view of an academic who wants them to be honest and informed. That being said, I mean, I would say one thing to start with, which is I was quite impressed with a lot of the media during the referendum, because we got contacted by all the major newspapers saying, can you sense check this that we've written about sovereignty? And there was a big division in the newspapers between the actual analysis bits, which were quite good, and the comment pages that were actually quite often just start raving mad. So the journalists themselves, I think, made an effort, but whatever went on in the comment page was a wholly different thing. We were never that well informed about the European Union in this country. I mean, the European Union has done polling for years on this. We were always amongst the bottom three when it came to how well informed we were about the European Union. But did that affect things? I mean, I know people who would swear blind that the more you know about the European Union, the less you like it. So I'm not saying it would have swung things one way or the other, but there were relatively low levels of information. And, the campaign was a traditional political campaign. Both sides made use of the lines they thought would win for them. And quite often, the lines they used had very little, if anything, to do with the European Union itself.
Would you say that after going through that, you are more or less in favour of referendums, which is obviously a pretty germane point to those of us in Scotland?
I think we need to have better rules around referendums, better rules around what sort of issues they're called for. There was a report by the Public Accounts Committee of the House of Commons, which said that we should avoid bluff call referendums, by which they meant referendums that were there just to get the no that you wanted, to seal off an option. And so if we need to have, I think, better legally defined conditions under which you call a referendum. And I think, cynically, calling a referendum to deal with the political parties inside your own party is not optimum for the country, because these things are very, very divisive.
What do you think about, you talk about the rules around referendums, 52-48 was pretty damn close, and the consequences of it have been with us ever since. Do you think there's an argument for thresholds, or is that for the birds?
Yes and no. I think the problem with having a threshold for the 2016 referendum was we didn't have one for the 1975 referendum. So there would have been immediate calls of foul play over that if we'd introduced sort of a higher bar to leave than we'd had to remain back in 1975. In general, it's not thresholds that worry me so much as the conditions around which you call a referendum and the issues on which you would have referendums. I think thresholds are slightly alien to our culture, and culture is crucial. I mean, I remember talking to the Swiss ambassador about this a few months after the referendum, and he said, well, it's quite clear to me, being Swiss, that if you had a result that was 52-48, what you'd do is you'd go away and discuss what to do next between the two sides because it was so close. Whereas, of course, in our system, you know, if you win a majority, and you could think back to the 1980s where Margaret Thatcher won enormous majorities on the back of, you know, 40-odd% of the vote. Once you've won, you've won. And that's the whole point of winner takes it all. You literally take it all. And that's just the culture we're used to. I mean, we can talk about whether or not that's the best culture for solving the sorts of policy problems we confront, because it probably isn't. But it's a culture we're used to. And it's hard to change something like that, I think.
Mm-hmm. Would you say, I mean, you say it was close 52-48. Obviously, in certain parts of the UK, it was less close. Scotland being an obvious example, 62-38, which I think in modern democratic terms is a bit of a monstrous win for the Remain side, really. Everything's been much closer than that. Yeah. That really was the result a surprise to you in the end, and what do you make of those regional variations and their consequences? So England and Wales both voted for Brexit. Scotland and Northern Ireland voted for Remain. Obviously, that's set a fire burning underneath the Union. It
was a surprise, and not because I didn't think there were that many people who wanted to vote Leave. It's simply because I didn't actually believe that a lot of the people who wanted to vote Leave would register and would vote. We spent an awful lot of time in the north of England in the run-up to the referendum. It was pretty clear what feelings were about the European Union. It's just that those tended to be people who didn't vote in elections. And actually, one of the most staggering statistics about the 2016 referendum for me is that I think 2.8 million people who had been eligible to vote in the 2015 general election but didn't registered to vote and voted in the referendum in 2016, and the majority of those people voted Leave. So actually, what I got wrong was turnout, I think, rather than the sentiment of the country. But yeah, you're absolutely right that the fact that Northern Ireland and Scotland voted one way and Wales and England voted another hasn't helped the problems with the devolution settlement that were inherent in the decision to leave the European Union. It goes beyond that. You know, look at the difference between cities and towns. Cities voted Remain in general, towns voted Leave. I'm here in Oxford, and Oxford is, you know, on a micro level, you've got some fascinating examples. So I live in East Oxford, which is the sort of studenty, liberal bit of Oxford, I suppose. I think in my ward, it was 95% Remain, which is just, you know, eye-watering by any standard. And yet in the ward that contains the BMW factory, the Mini factory, they voted Leave, which some people might think is slightly counterintuitive.
Yes, yes. No, it's fascinating looking at the map of how it went. So anyway, we vote to leave, and Westminster really descends into some years of chaos and often farce. We have a quick rush through 3 prime ministers, from Cameron to May to Johnson. Dominic Cummings enters our lives, as does David Frost. Deals are done, then abandoned. Votes are won and lost in the Commons. Laws are broken. The red wall falls to the Conservative Party. What was this convulsion? Was there more to it than a relationship with the EU? Was that a symptom rather than a cause, do you think, of broader discontents?
A bit of both. I think, you know, let's not kid ourselves. Leaving the European Union is a difficult thing to do. So you could have had, you know, Superman as Prime Minister with a majority of 350, and it would still have been tricky because it's just very, very complicated intrinsically. As it happened, we didn't have Superman, and she didn't have a majority of 350. So that made it much, much messier. The reason she called that election in 2017 was because she feared losing votes because her majority was so slim. As soon as you've got a minority government dealing with the most divisive political issue of recent times, then I think it's easy to say with hindsight, but I think even at the time, people thought this is going to be very, very messy indeed. But what I would say is, in a sense, I mean, a lot of people explain this in terms of Parliament failing us. You can turn that on its head and say, well, actually, what Parliament did was accurately reflect the fact that the British people were divided down the middle about this. And there actually wasn't a stable majority either in Parliament or amongst the British people for any of the outcomes. So if you said soft Brexit, hard Brexit, no Brexit, nothing got over 50%. And so it was inherently problematic just because the issue divided us so profoundly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned earlier that, in a sense, the referendum was called by one party to address the problems with its own internal factions. And I wonder what your judgment is now of how things stand in the Conservative Party. Has this given it a chance to lay to rest 40 years of mania? Has the party moved beyond its splits? Will those, the awkward squad, look for new reasons to be grumpy now? Or what do you detect about the inner workings of the Conservative Party?
Well, they clearly haven't lost their mania, in the sense that I suspect, one of the things about Brexit was it was meant to allow our politicians to take responsibility for what went on in this country. And the early signs post-Brexit are we're going to spend the next decade plus blaming the European Union for everything that goes wrong, even though we're out of it. So that sort of desire to blame Europe for stuff, and I think there are some Tory MPs who are genuinely enjoying it at the moment, is you can just put the finger to Brussels and say they're being unreasonable. But the fundamental difference is the Conservative Party is now united around this. And that even those Tory MPs who are slightly uncomfortable about the direction of travel know it's simply not worth saying anything out loud. And what Boris Johnson did in December 2019 was he basically brought together a Leave coalition. I think from the BES data, 82% of Tory voters in December 2019 were Leave supporters. So in a sense, what the Conservatives have done is displace the division in their ranks. The division is no longer over Brexit, but there is a really interesting division now at the heart of the movement and between MPs over economics that wasn't there before. So the old Conservative Party agreed on conservative economics. Okay, the party of the small state, of low taxes, of fiscal rectitude. Now you've got the Northern Recovery Group, who sound like what Labour are meant to sound like. They're talking about maintaining the universal credit uplift, having a bigger state, borrowing for investment, rebalancing, dealing with inequality. And you're thinking, my God, this is a large chunk of the Parliamentary Conservative Party saying this. Where the hell have I landed? So I suspect that what we will see when we come out of the pandemic and start politics more or less as normal again, talking about the economy, the role of the state, those divisions will come front and centre within Tory ranks.
Well, talking about Labour, I'm interested in your thoughts on the impact that Jeremy Corbyn had, both on the result of the referendum and the aftermath. I mean, Keir Starmer's approach now, his decision to back the deal rather than abstain, decision to move on from rejoining or the second referendum argument, which seems based on maybe just reality and pragmatism. And I guess, interesting what you think about Corbyn, but also what is the centre-left path now through Brexit and the UK developing outside of the EU? What are the challenges and opportunities there?
I hope you've all noticed, incidentally, that he asked about 6 questions at once and expects me to remember them all, which I won't. So
you're supposed to be brainy.
Brainy and old with a failing memory. How's that?
Oh, Jeremy Corbyn. Let's start with Corbyn.
When I forget half of them, just tell me. On the referendum itself, I mean, one of the interesting things about the referendum is what the data shows is that during the campaign, virtually no one at all in the whole country changed their mind. That the polling about who was pro-Leave, who was pro-Remain just didn't change. What did change, and I referred to this earlier, is the Leave campaign were very, very effective at mobilising their people to actually come out and vote. That was the key difference. So yes, it is conceivable that someone who put a bit more work into the campaign than Jeremy Corbyn might have got more Labour voters out to vote. I'm not convinced that sharing a platform with David Cameron would have been the way ahead for him. It certainly wouldn't have been the way ahead for his party. But actually putting a bit more oomph into that campaign, being a bit more helpful with the Britain Stronger in Europe campaign, I think could have got some more voters. I mean, Corbyn was almost sort of comically unhelpful. I mean, after one speech, Google reported that one of the most searched things was, what is the Labour position on the referendum, because no one was quite sure, because he seemed a bit lukewarm. There was another point in the campaign where, and I'm not making this up, he was saying he was going to go to Turkey to make a speech about how we should remove borders. And remember, this is a moment when the threat of Turkey joining and the threat of immigration was the key plank of the Leave campaign. Jeremy was going to go over to Turkey and say, I wish you'd all come over. I mean, so yes, you could have had a more helpful leader in terms of that campaign, no doubt about it. I don't think it would have changed minds, but it might have changed turnout. But I mean, you have to say this to a Scottish audience. The proportion of Labour voters who voted Leave was, I think, identical to about 1 or 2 percentage points to the proportion of SNP voters who voted Leave. So, you know, Corbyn got a lot more flack for the same result that Nicola Sturgeon achieved than she did.
And now moving on from the vote, the centre-left is trying to get its head together about what its philosophy, its values and its policies should be outside of the EU. Obviously, the EU, in some senses, acted as a support mechanism under workers' rights and that kind of thing, but equally, the bureaucracy got in the way of other things, which was maybe one of the reasons Jeremy Corbyn wasn't so enthusiastic about staying. What do you see the left's path, the centre-left's path, to be now?
Well, let me say one thing to start with. I've always been profoundly sceptical of this argument. We need to be in the European Union to have environmental regulation, to have workers' rights. Because my thought has always been on that. If you want those regulations, win the sodding argument. You know, win it at home, then you won't need the European Union. You should be able to convince your own people that these things are good and not simply use the European Union as a backdoor to circumvent Parliament to get things on the statute books that would never arrive on the statute books through our own volition. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you take what I said about the Conservative Party, which is they're relatively united on values, and Brexit is a values issue. Brexit, you know, you can tell if someone's position on Brexit by whether they're a social liberal or a social conservative. Social conservatives tended to vote Brexit, okay? The Tories are relatively united on values, quite divided on economics. The exact opposite is the case for the Labour Party. Labour want to be talking about economics because their voters and their MPs are united on a broad centre-left economic platform. When it comes to values, Labour are all over the place, and that's the thing that everyone says, Hampstead versus Hull. I remember, just to give you an idea, in 1 week, I think it was in 2018. I mean, one of the things about lockdown is I've completely lost all sense of time. I think it was 2018. During the course of that week, I went to talk to Lisa Nandy's constituency party in Wigan on the Tuesday. And on the Thursday, I went to talk to Keir Starmer's constituency party on the Thursday. Okay, so Wigan and Primrose Hill. And my God, I mean, you could barely believe that these people came from the same planet, let alone the same party, because Wigan was about benefits, education, access to hospitals. Primrose Hill was about sustainability, recycling, international development aid. And so the Labour Party is riven between those two sorts of people, if you like. And they can broadly agree on a redistributive economic agenda. But if you start talking to them about Brexit, then that polarisation comes out again. So you can see why Keir Starmer will do anything in his power to avoid saying the B word. Because it will bring out the splits in his party and it will give an open door to Boris Johnson to say, Remainer-in-Chief, Keir Starmer. On the other hand, the fact of the matter is that over the next 5 to 10 years, Brexit will have a far greater impact on the British economy than COVID will. Okay, the COVID impact will be very, very significant, very, very severe, but relatively short-lived. The Brexit economic impact will be far more subtle, far more slow burn, but ultimately will be 2 to 3 times the size of the COVID impact of our economy over the long term. And it seems to me that if Labour want to be crafting a narrative about economic competence in the run-up to the next election, it's going to be very hard to do that without talking about Brexit. Because Brexit will be the drag anchor on our economy in 2024 and not COVID.
And I suppose you know, there's a generation, I know that older people tend to vote more, but there's a generation who their experience of a Conservative government maybe starts in 2010 and an era of austerity and public service cuts, and then the chaos of Brexit, and now this, you know, almost socialist state spending that we're seeing. Do you think the Conservatives can rely on their tradition for good economic husbandry in the way that they maybe could around the turn of the century, or are they having to rethink, just as Labour are, what their offer is to a changing society around them?
Well, I mean, if you look at the polls at the moment, the Conservatives have every right to feel quite pleased with themselves. And, you know, one of the things that Boris Johnson successfully did at the last election was make it sound like we were electing a new government. So essentially dismissed everything that went before as someone else. This is me. This is a whole new thing. I think part of the question about whether the Tories retain a reputation for economic competence is how well Starmer makes his criticisms of their handling of the post-pandemic economic crisis stick. I mean, this is the big thing. I mean, if we were to talk again in 6 months' time, we'd be in a wholly different world, because all of a sudden we wouldn't be fretting about lockdown and, you know, whether we can get to the pub again. We'd be worrying about skyrocketing unemployment and an economy that looks very, very shaky as we come out of lockdown, as firms let furloughed people go. Okay. And I think that whole political debate for this parliament is going to hinge on how effectively the government addresses that problem. If it doesn't address it successfully, if we're left with significant amounts of over the medium term of unemployment, I think then the Tories are in trouble with their reputation for economic competence. If, however, we bounce out of this in that V-shaped recovery that some economists still insist we're going to have, then I think they can hold on to it.
That's interesting. Well, moving on from the vote, etc., onto maybe some of the challenges that we now face. We obviously left and within a very short period of time had fallen out with the EU over vaccination contracts, and now the extension of the grace period in relation to Irish sea checks on goods. Is this a sign of things to come? Would you think it will get worse? Will it just be a constant state of sniping at each other and attempting to outdo one another? You know, do we think David Frost, who's now the cabinet minister of the EU, is the chap to keep relations smooth there? But more than that, interested in what you think how will the relationship noodle on as time passes?
I think the first thing to say is the EU fell out with us over vaccines. We didn't particularly fall out with them over vaccines. I mean, there was some rubbish talked about the fact that being out of the EU allowed us to do what we did, even though we were in transition and bound by all the rules. We could have done what we did even if we were a member state. But I think the EU acted pretty badly. And by the EU, I don't just mean the comments made by Ursula von der Leyen. I mean the comments made by President Macron as well about the AstraZeneca vaccine. There was absolutely no need for that sort of thing. And I think, that, sadly, the answer to your question is we will remain in a state of tension with the European Union for several reasons. One, because it works to the Tories' political advantage to be in a state of tension with the European Union, because that motivates the base, gets them behind. EU are interfering again. EU are being unreasonable, plays to those Tory electors that he attracted in the last election. But also, there's going to be a state of tension because if you flip to the other side, one, the EU now see us as a competitor economy. So they're not going to do us any favours. It's not beyond the wit of man, for heaven's sake, to come up with a fudge that allows us to export British sausages to Northern Ireland. I mean, you could do inventories in the supermarkets to make sure that the stuff that's exported ends up where it's meant to end up and that it doesn't enter EU territory. There are ways around it. But actually, for some in the EU, this is like, well, no, they're a competitor now. Why should we give them a free pass? And the second element from the EU side, I think, is if you are President Macron and you're facing what might turn out to be quite a difficult presidential election next year, where you're confronted with a populist leader in the form of Marine Le Pen, what you really want to be able to do this time next year is turn to her, point at the United Kingdom and say, that's what populism gets you. Do you really want to vote for that? So it is in the political interests of some EU leaders for Brexit to be observably a failure. And that's not going to help when it comes to trying to reconcile some of these genuinely difficult issues over the protocol. So I suspect low-level tension is something we're going to have to get used to.
You mentioned sausages, but that's one example of a large number. Have you had much feedback or experience of people on the ground now being affected by the new Brexit rules? So businesses and whatever are trying to trade with the EU or trade with Northern Ireland or whatever, and how that's going with obviously issues with the fishermen in Scotland. What are you hearing about the reality of day-to-day business?
Well, it's a very varied picture. I mean, if you're exporting mollusks from the wrong waters, you can't do it anymore because of EU rules. This isn't something they made up after Brexit. This was just EU rules. There are certain niche things like you can get special immigration status for people coming in doing food picking, but not people coming in doing flower picking. One of the things you notice in the shops here, I don't know if it's the same there, is you can't find daffodils anymore. You can't find daffodils because they're all rotting in the fields because we can't get immigrants in to pick them, which is what we would have used to do. So there are all sorts of difficulties in trading now. And, you can pick up any newspaper and, well, maybe not the Mail. And, you will find stories of businesses that are struggling to trade as they once did. And remember, we haven't hit the full impact yet. No one's buying cars at the moment, okay? So the full extent of the problems that Brexit will cause the car industry are not yet apparent because they're just shipping far fewer parts than they used to. Service providers aren't traveling around providing services. Roger Daltrey can't go on tour in the European Union, even if he wanted to. But if he were allowed to, he would realize that actually, A, he'd have to get a visa, that B, all their instruments would have to be registered and you'd have to pay for those, and that C, if you decided to go on a coach, that coach would only be allowed to stop in 2 places before it came back for the United Kingdom, so it wouldn't be much of a tour. And they're all the rules that await people when business gets back to normal again post-Brexit. And the biggest hit is going to be for services, because there's very little in the trade deal with the EU about services. And services, of course, are sort of voluntarily asleep at the moment in terms of face-to-face trading because of COVID. So there are more impacts yet to come.
Talking about services, and obviously one of the areas, the sectors that's dominated discussion has been the financial sector, and London's ongoing centre is the global home of finance. Do you see that there will be, you get stories about banks setting up elsewhere, you also get stories about banks investing more in certain places in the UK. Do you think it will be a matter of time and that there'll be a drip factor away from London, or can passporting and other things fix that? And is London just too big and too central and too important to lose its place?
A bit of all of that. London is big, important, central. London has infrastructure, the law firms, the accountancy firms that make a successful financial services centre work. And London, let's face it, is just a damn sight better place to live than Frankfurt. And, getting people to go and live in Frankfurt is a lot harder than it may seem, particularly if they're used to living in London. London's a great place to live if you have loads of money. And in the financial services sector, you have quite a few people with loads of money. So London won't disappear as a major international financial centre, but our trade with the European Union will fall away quite dramatically because there is no option for passporting. I don't think the EU is going to give us a very good equivalence decision if they give us one at all, because they see us as a competitor now. And as a result of all of that, it's going to have an impact on the financial services industry. So yes, some banks have set up administrative headquarters in the EU to pretend to be an EU business. Other banks have moved business to the European Union because they worry about not being able to do that trading. And one interesting story is back in, I think, 2011, the European Central Bank got very upset by the sheer volume of euro trading that went on in London. And they said, well, hang on a sec. In terms of our oversight role, we have a major economy that is outside our purview doing the bulk of euro trading. And that's not good, okay, for financial stability. And the European Court of Justice said, actually, you can't move against London because you can't discriminate against a member state. So you can't change your rules to discriminate against a member state. Of course, we're no longer a member state, and we will no longer, to use a phrase you don't hear very often, enjoy the protection of the European Court of Justice if the European Central Bank tries that again. So I suspect, yes, there will be a gradual shift of business into the European Union over time.
What about inward investment from non-EU countries who might, perhaps in the past, have seen the UK as a sort of market-friendly bridge to the EU? We've got all sorts of estimates, but I think the OBR says they reckon Brexit will cost us something like 4% of GDP. We're no longer going to be inside the world's largest trading bloc. Brexiteers argue that we can make that up and possibly even surpass it by extending our trade patterns around the rest of the world. But if you're a company in a non-EU country looking at the UK now compared to the UK you were looking at in 2012, say, what are you seeing?
Well, you're seeing a country that is still attractive in a number of ways. We've got a flexible labour force, which isn't the case in most EU member states. English is the spoken language here, which is appealing for some. We have pretty good skills in some sectors, engineering and things like that. It's no secret that Nissan have renewed their investment here. But yeah, one of the things that made us attractive was we could manufacture here and send stuff over easily to the European Union. Now, for some things, that remains the case. If you make it in the United Kingdom and sell it to the European Union, there are no tariffs or anything like that. You've got to apply for certification for your goods in the EU and the UK. There are some additional costs, not overwhelming. But certainly for some firms, the idea of investing in the United Kingdom is far less appealing than it was, given the fact that the UK is now the gateway, no longer the gateway to the single market. And one of the things that being inside gave us was a seat at the table. The EU is a regulatory superpower in the sense that the sheer size of its market meant if the EU adopted a regulation. So EU environmental standards for cars were adopted by Chinese car manufacturers. Okay, not because they had to, not because they were in the single market, but because they wanted to export to the European Union. And to do that, you need to obey EU standards. So in that sense, we lose a seat at the table. I know, for instance, that the car firms are very, very anxious about letting their European competitors set the standards that will determine their ability to sell into one of their largest markets.
And I guess there's also the issue of the tension about global Britain versus a Britain that's actually retrenching from that. So, the UK is a champion of free trade and globalisation. I was reading an article of yours that said something like 21%, including 35% of Conservative Leave-supporting voters, actually took it to mean the UK would have strong secure borders and be focused on the issues at home.
Yeah.
So there's a balance, or is there a balance, between a form of protectionism and even isolationism and this global liberal presence that we're perhaps renowned for in past centuries?
There is a tension, yeah. Let me actually, there's a question of yours I forgot to answer from last time, which is, there is no way in the foreseeable future that trade with other countries will make up for lost trade with the European Union. And the simple reason for that is geography. Countries don't trade as much with countries that are far away as they do with countries that are close by. The vast majority of, the European Union is our nearest and our biggest trading partner for a reason. So even if we sign these trade deals, and even these trade deals get significantly better because many of them simply replicate what we already had, it is inconceivable, unless technology shifts dramatically, that is going to make up for lost trade with the European Union. When I say technology, I mean, you could imagine a world in the future, say, where 3D printers replace traditional supply chains, and where basically all you do is sell patents rather than goods. You sell patents to the people who have the 3D printers and they print on site, okay? You could imagine a world like that. We're not in that sort of world now. There is some economic evidence even of a geographic effect on eBay. So even online trade shows geographic biases because you want to order from places where the postal costs are cheaper or the delivery time is shorter or whatever else. So for the medium term, there's nothing we can do in terms of trading with China or New Zealand or anywhere else that is going to make up for the hit to our trading when it comes to the European Union. The second thing is, as you rightly said, there is a tension. There was a tension in the, I mean, Brexit meant different things to different people, okay? Whilst Tory Brexiters were going around talking about we want to leave the European Union to become more global, to sign trade deals, to become this buccaneering force again, many Leave voters saw Brexit as a sort of way of pulling up the drawbridge. And the drawbridge not only when it came to immigration, but also when it came to competition from cheap Chinese manufactured goods. They wanted to be able to say, okay, let's just not have that unfair competition. Let's be less global rather than more global. At the moment, the government seems to be following its instincts rather than the instincts of those voters. But there is a tension there. And we don't yet know how the government intends to resolve it. I think trade negotiations with the United States will be a nice case study of this.
Well, that's true, and I suppose the closer we get to the next election with the red wall seats in play, Boris's instinct for liberal and pro trade might meet up with the people who voted for Brexit, because they did want to lift the drawbridge a bit more. So the politics might get in the way of the principle more at that point.
It's always worth stressing, though, if you look at how well and by how much the Conservatives won at the last election, just how vanishingly unlikely it is that Labour will win the next election. Yeah,
but they could nevertheless chop the lead substantially. They've obviously got a leader of slightly more prime ministerial qualities, and I don't think the current lead will last up till the next election. If you like, it'll certainly at that point.
That's true. Though it does pose an interesting question as to what prime ministerial qualities mean nowadays.
Yes.
Boris Johnson has perfected the art of performative politics. So it's all about the act. It's all about the statement. It's all about saying levelling up without ever telling anyone what it means. It's all about the gesture. It's all about, the bulldozer through the brick wall that says get Brexit done. Keir Starmer's rubbish at that. Okay, he's very good at a slightly old-fashioned sort of politics that would have maybe was what was needed in the first decade of this century. I just don't know whether it's what will work now. My suspicion is it might not be quite right for the sort of way we approach politics now.
It'll be interesting to see how that develops. You mentioned trade deals with America, China, as well as thinking of the largest countries. And our usefulness to the Americans over the years is we've obviously got a defence and security role, but our role as that pro-market, often pro-US, foreign policy aligned agitators within the EU has obviously been diminished. So a trade deal may be done, but we obviously lack the scale of the EU when it's doing its own trade deals. We're certainly much smaller than the Americans and the Chinese. What's the process then for securing a trade deal that does speak to both our values and our economic needs, and not just having really to take what we're given rather than do without completely?
I mean, firstly, the relationship with the US is obviously a lot wider than just trade. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. I don't think trade is a priority of the Biden administration. His priority is domestic. Mm. His priority is delivering for those people in the Midwest, you know, their equivalent, if you like, of the Red Wall, who gave him the electoral victory this time round. And the way to do that is not to be seen to be gallivanting around the world, signing trade deals with people, because the American mood on trade is very, very negative at the moment. So I think we'll have to wait. And I think when it happens, it will be a relatively minor trade deal, simply because of the regulatory issues each side will face if we want to do something more major. Do we really want to lower food standards to allow US imports in? Politically, very, very hard to do. The economic impact of it, I mean, the LSE did a study on this about 4 or 5 years ago. If you signed a trade deal with the US and scrapped every single tariff in existence, I think the net benefit to the economy is about 0.3% of GDP. 0.3% compared to most forecasts. The average forecast for the impact of Brexit over the UK economy is 7% over 10 years. So this is 0.3% compared to 7%. So it's minuscule compared to that. In broader foreign policy terms, it's really interesting, because on the one hand, Boris Johnson, in terms of his stated foreign policy objectives, and Joe Biden are in the same place on all the major issues of our time, whether it's dealing with Russia, authoritarian states in general, attitudes towards China, attitudes towards Iran, attitudes towards multilateralism, and crucially, attitudes towards climate. And it's worth bearing in mind that this year is an absolutely crucial one for British foreign policy, because we chair the Security Council, we chair the G7, and we chair the COP26. It's a great opportunity. You couldn't have asked for a better opportunity to sell global Britain as Prime Minister than this year, and all the things. You know, you get to chair a summit of the world leaders in Cornwall in June. So I suspect whatever personal animus there might be between members of the US administration and members of this government over Brexit, over comments about Barack Obama or whatever, that we will end up working quite closely with the US. And in particular on China, where we are aligned with the US in a way that the European Union simply isn't. So the one big question around this, which takes us back to Brexit, I'm afraid, is what the Americans will do if we are seen to be undermining the Northern Ireland Protocol and thereby the Good Friday Agreement. That, for me, is the big question in terms of relations with the US.
Okay, I have many more questions, but looking at time, I think we should move on to the audience. So please keep your questions coming. If you just send them using the messaging doodah on the screen, that would be great. Donald McCrae, do you want to go first, Donald?
Yeah, thanks. I'll keep my camera off to help the broadband width. Slightly tongue-in-cheek question for you. Very simple question. Will the UK ever rejoin the EU?
Well, you never say never. Not in the foreseeable future would be my answer. For the UK even to start thinking about rejoining the European Union, one of the two big parties has to adopt it as a policy. Okay, it needs to get on the political agenda for it to be serious. And at the moment, there is simply no way, well, certainly the Conservatives aren't going to adopt it as a policy in the near term, but Keir Starmer isn't either, for the reasons I outlined before. He wants to shift the political battle off that terrain onto something else where he thinks he might win. So absolutely no way it's going to be debated before the next election. I very much doubt it will be before the one after. The other thing to bear in mind is we'd have to have a referendum on this, whether we like referendums or not. And we would have to vote to rejoin the European Union on terms that were far less favourable than those under which we left. That is to say, there would be no budget rebate, there would be no euro opt-out, there would be no Schengen opt-out. The EU won't make what they see as the same mistake as they made before by giving us a sweet deal that we could then abuse. They would say, you join fully. You are a committed member of this club in all its aspects. So I think it's a long way down the line, to be honest. I mean, we could talk a bit, if you like. There's another question about the economic impacts of Brexit. And I'll talk about it when we get to that one, but it ties in with how visible those effects really are.
I suppose one would presume that part of the case for Brexit is to diverge from EU standards and rules and regulations, and that the longer we're out of the EU, the more that divergence will take place, and actually squeezing us back in could become harder to do rather than...
Kind of. I mean, if you'd said to me 5 years ago a Tory government would take us out of the European Union, I'd have thought, you know, John Redwood, deregulation, slash and burn, you know, bonfire of the regulations, environmental stuff, workers' protection stuff. I'm not so sure anymore for two reasons. One is I think a lot of leavers, when they said take back control, literally meant have control. Didn't necessarily mean do anything with that control. It just meant the principle of having the right to if you wanted to, even though you don't. And the second thing is, I wonder about the Tory party in Parliament now, whether there is backing for the kind of deregulatory agenda that initially drove those Tory Eurosceptics post-Maastricht. I'm not so sure anymore. So it might well be that we end up having the right to diverge without diverging at all, or maybe not very much at all.
And that the whole idea of Singapore on the Thames, as some of the more maybe libertarian Tories were looking for, you know, the fact that Brexit has combined with COVID to open up the gates of government spending and all sorts of, you know, the timing isn't great for that wing of the Brexit argument, I guess. Do you think there is the possibility, though, that as time goes on, and you know, we have to fight economically for everything that we get, that we will see a kind of leaner, meaner UK out in the world?
Possibly. I mean, that's sort of so far into the future, I'd hate to speculate. It's certainly conceivable that the Tory party reverts to type. It's interesting, though, that perhaps the most outspoken proponent of this deregulatory agenda at the moment is Daniel Hannan, who didn't manage to get himself a seat.
Well, he's got one now without being elected.
Yeah, but he didn't manage to get himself a college. So at the moment, I'd be sceptical. Down the line, who knows? But I mean, it would take a realignment of politics again. I don't discount the possibility of this. Our politics has realigned to be more along values lines than along the traditional left-right lines that we were used to, which is why you now have to say things like, you know, the Tories won Mansfield or Labour won Canterbury, things that you wouldn't have thought possible with the traditional class basis of our politics. That could get realigned. And once again, I think the length and severity of the post-COVID economic crisis will help determine whether those left-right issues come front and centre again or not.
Okay, Karen Friel, are you there, Karen?
Apologies about that. Yes, trying to do too many things at once. So if you can bear with me. My question was, I know I used to work for a member of the European Parliament, so I'm very aware about the powers of the EU. And currently the EU will only recognise full sovereign states. Do you think moving forward that will change and the EU will recognise regions of states? So, for example, that perhaps Scotland could rejoin the EU, or do you think because of Spain and Catalonia, that's definitely off the cards? Thank you.
I think it's definitely off the cards at the moment, simply because there isn't a constituency in the EU who sees it as a priority to push for, and because you've got the Spanish who would always be saying no. So unless you've got a coalition of member states who, for their own interests, thought it would be great if we could start recognising sort of subnational regions with a view to persuading them maybe to join in their own right, you're not going to get anywhere with that. The EU wouldn't want to rock that particular boat. I was quite surprised, to be honest, when the EU said what they said about Erasmus and Scottish students, that they wanted to explore ways of seeing if that programme could continue. I thought that was a bit brazen, actually, and risked a bit of a backlash, but I don't think they'll go much further.
Well, a follow-on question from that, from Keith MacDonald. Keith, if you're with us.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, right. Well, my question basically was, on the positive side, what can Scotland do to have as good a relationship without having to do another Brexit and leave the UK?
As good as a relationship with the European Union?
Yes, with the European Union countries, sorry. Yes.
I think Scotland has managed very well to create a niche for itself where it's looked at very sympathetically by the EU and by member states, hence the thing on Erasmus. I think keeping an active diplomatic presence in Brussels is useful and important. I think just replicating that within the member states as well, so maintaining cultural exchange, talking about trading links. I think keeping Scotland in the minds of both member states and the European Union is very, very important. Much more than that, it's very, very hard to do. I should do a little plug, I suppose, that Stephen Gethins, the former SNP MP, has just written a book about Scotland's foreign policy footprint, which is quite interesting about this, because he's reflected on, you know, what can Scotland do in the way of foreign policy, even whilst part of the United Kingdom. And I think there are some good tips in there for how the country maintains its profile and its reputation while still being short of independence.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's looking like a great book. Richard Marsh. Are you here, Richard?
I am. Sorry, just trying to unmute there. It was a slightly tongue-in-cheek question, I suppose, but it's just to say the Office for Budget Responsibility is predicting substantial increase in economic growth at just the time that you've already said the longer-term impacts of Brexit will be kicking in. And it strikes me as some of the impacts were around, for example, the switching of perhaps tourism towards more of a domestic tourism market and less reliant on international markets. That's the kind of thing we're seeing from COVID, but it's exactly the kind of impacts you would be picking up from Brexit. So it's going to be incredibly difficult to pick those things apart. And it strikes me at exactly the kind of time frame you've set out today, the political parties will have a significant interest in saying, look how well things are going. So is it possible to pick those things apart? And do we think they will be picked apart?
I don't think econometrically it's possible now. I think 10, 15 years hence, you can look back at the trade data and maybe compare our trade patterns with those of our nearest neighbours and say, okay, these are COVID effects in common across all of them. But here's a significant difference to how the UK recovered, and that is down to Brexit. So, I mean, I've always thought one of the problems with this argument about cliff edge was it's fundamentally misleading. Is the Brexit economic impact will not be a cliff edge. We won't suddenly think, oh my God, what have we done? It will play out over time. It will be a slow process of accretion, and it will be a story of growth foregone rather than growth lost. So when people say 7% hits the British economy, they don't mean that GDP falls by 7%. They mean that GDP is 7% smaller than it would have been in an alternative reality where we hadn't left. And that's quite hard to spot, okay? To do that counterfactual in your head, unless you're paid to do those sorts of counterfactuals in your head, is not the sort of thing most people do. So you're absolutely right. I think the government has got a bit of an opportunity here to disguise the immediate impacts of Brexit going forward. I think, though, one of the things we've learned from the Brexit referendum is that anecdotes are probably more powerful than data. And so, you know, during the referendum campaign, whilst the aggregate economics was absolutely clear that immigration from the European Union was good for the United Kingdom economy, and that it hadn't in general, except maybe to a tiny extent, had a lowering impact on wages. The Leave campaign were able to come up with case studies of, you know, here's Fred Bloggs from somewhere or other whose plumbing business no longer exists because the Poles have arrived in town. And I think there will be an opportunity to do that the other way around going forward, in the sense that we will keep getting stories of companies who've gone under because of Brexit over the course of the next few years, whose trading model just doesn't work under the new post-Brexit trading conditions. So I suspect it'll be interesting to see whether A, the Labour Party decide to take an active role in that debate, and B, if not, whether sort of anti-Brexit groups capitalise on those sorts of stories to try and spin their narrative. And bear in mind as well, it's worth saying, even though it's only a slight possibility, there is still a slight but real possibility of a no-deal Brexit. The EU haven't ratified the trade and cooperation agreement at the moment. The European Parliament have just delayed their vote on ratification of the agreement, and if the British are seen to be not playing nicely with the commitments they've already signed up to, there is a not insignificant danger, I think, that the European Parliament says, well, we can't trust them, why would we sign?
Okay. John Rowland, it's a good question.
Yes, thank you. What are your views on the actual cohesion of the EU itself? So on the one hand, you've got Macron crusading federal Europe. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, you've got a certain degree of skepticism, and then right across Europe, you've got a populist element amongst populations of nearly all the EU countries. And that clearly could have an impact on the future direction of Europe. Any thoughts on that?
I think the East-West division is real and serious and very, very hard to bridge. Let me say, I mean, first of all, we're talking about the unity of the European Union. Nothing I say here is meant to imply that someone else is going to want to leave. No one else wants to leave. Okay, so this isn't about other member states trying to emulate the UK. But there is a real division between East and West. It's getting worse rather than better. And it might well hinder the functioning of the European Union if, for instance, the Poles and the Hungarians just decide to wield their vetoes out of malice, spite, pettiness, or a desire to prove a point to the other Europeans. So decision-making will get harder. More rosy news, I suppose, is that the European Recovery Fund, this massive, great bailout fund that they've agreed, a mixture of loans and grants, has served to dampen down the tension between North and South that became so apparent during the Eurozone crisis. So in that way, at least one set of divisions has been quietened down. And you're absolutely right. The fundamental problem facing the European Union, I think, is at national level. That is to say, if you see populists getting elected, I mean, I don't think it's going to happen, but just for the sake of argument, the EU would look very different if Marine Le Pen was attending European Council meetings. Okay, I mean, for obvious reasons. Equally, I think if a populist government gets elected in Italy, I think the year after, if a government who sees it as in their interests to show they are being an absolute nightmare in Brussels gets elected, particularly in a larger member state, it will have a very, very damaging impact on the European Union because it will make it virtually impossible to take decisions.
Okay, John Rowland. No, we've just had John. Sorry, apologies. Back to referendums. Paul Spicker has a question.
Thanks. I wanted to ask whether we could draw any lessons from the experience of the European referendum for future referenda, and I'm thinking obviously of the possibility of a second referendum in Scotland. One of the things that we know from political science on referenda is that they're subject to capture by a relatively small group of people if there isn't a counterbalance. And the obvious question is, well, I suppose question one is that what actually happened with the European referendum, and could it happen in Scotland? I
think in general, you're right with the specifics, but it was far more complicated than that. I think, for instance, if you look at the context of the 2016 referendum, there were lots of things that contributed. A really skillful campaign, you shouldn't discount that, and a fantastic slogan from the Leave campaign, Take Back Control, was utter political genius. A Remain side that was divided and which refused to take its gloves off when attacking the leaders of the Leave campaign was also crucial. David Cameron basically vetoed blue on blue politics. There was one poster that the Remain campaign had all ready to go, which was a picture. You remember the picture of Ed Miliband in the pocket of Nicola Sturgeon? They had one with Boris Johnson and Michael Gove in the breast pocket of Nigel Farage, which had performed really, really, really well in focus groups. David Cameron vetoed it. So I think there are sort of contingencies around that you need to take into account. And I think if you transpose this to the Scottish case, firstly, because this debate has been going on for so long, it's not a niche issue captured by one small group anymore. I mean, this is a pan-Scottish conversation. I mean, I know from my times in Scotland, if you go into bars or restaurants, you'll probably bump into someone talking about it. So it's slightly different. But I think one of the key things is the faith and trust there is in the individuals involved. And I think in that context, what's going on in Holyrood at the moment is absolutely crucial to the future of the independence movement, because I think, you know, levels of trust and faith in Nicola Sturgeon and her government are going to correlate quite closely with outcomes in any possible referendum, and indeed with the elections in May.
Well, looking beyond that to perhaps the prospect of a yes vote, Karen Betts, you have a question for us.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks very much, Anand. Really interesting running through those issues. So my question was, so, you know, say there is an independence referendum in Scotland in the, you know, next 2 or 3 years, or whatever we think the time horizon might be, and say that the yes vote wins. How do you think that Europe is going to handle, you know, a potential application for Scotland to join the EU? And I mean, I suppose, I mean, I was working in the EU when the Accession 10 came in back in 2004, and politics, not least of the European Union, seemed a great deal more straightforward then, or perhaps I'm looking back on the past with rosy tinted spectacles myself, but it seems to me that the politics of Europe are quite a lot more complicated now, and the politics of how Scotland leaves the UK would no doubt be quite complicated. So how do you think that Europe would treat Scotland? And I sometimes think we risk looking at that question from with a bit of a rosy tint ourselves, that if Scotland leaves the European Union, that sympathy that you talked about, we would be welcomed back in, but I suspect that the process could be quite a lot harder. What do you think?
I mean, there is a lot more opposition to enlargement now than there was in 2004 amongst the member states. A couple of member states are now talking referendums for any possible enlargement, so that's certainly true. I still think Scotland that had voted in a legal constitutional referendum for independence would be treated well by the European Union. I think the usual sorts of fears that characterise a sort of generic debate about independence, whether that's race, Turkey, low paid wage employees coming west to get better wages in the case of Central, Southern, Southeastern Europe, isn't the case with Scotland. So I think a lot of those primary fears associated with enlargement simply wouldn't apply. I think the euro would be an issue in those negotiations. I mean, obviously a lot will depend on what happens with negotiations with the rest of the UK as well. I think the euro would be insisted on. I think one of the things that the UK has done is it's fundamentally shifted the balance of power in the European Union, and the euro group now dominates to an extent it simply couldn't do when we were on the outside of that. So there's a decision to be made there by the Scots that I think the EU will say, if you join, you sign up to join the euro when your economy is ready for it. But I still think, and this almost goes back to the earlier question about Scottish presence, Scottish diplomacy, the Scots have done well at portraying themselves as a European state from which they have nothing to fear from. And I still think that's the case, though obviously 2 or 3 years down the line, who knows?
Okay, I saw Jim Sillars raising his hand pleasingly. Do you want to ask something or say something, Jim? You need to unmute yourself.
And I'll turn off the video. Well, right, turn off the video. There you are. I am one of the million Brexiteers in Scotland. If you actually look at the totality of the vote in the UK, we're the ones actually who took it into the Leave position. And that creates a problem for the SNP and people who think yes vote for the SNP and then a yes vote to rejoin the European Union. Because at the moment, the SNP has glued independence to re-entry to the European Union. I've just had one of the leaflets through my door. What do myself and the others in the million do? I had very good reasons, in my view, for leaving the European Union. I vote independence and accept that automatically that means I'm endorsing re-entry. When I would consider that we would be asking for re-entry, we would have absolutely no currency of our own. How could we possibly resist being required to immediately joining the euro? And when you join the euro, you give up a very substantial amount of the sovereignty we've just gained by voting for independence from the United Kingdom. As anybody who wants to talk about that just needs to go and talk to the Greeks about whether they could be sovereign inside the Eurozone. The question I've got for Anand is that the assumption all through the comments you've made is that Brexit will be a negative effect over the next 10 years on the United Kingdom economy. Isn't it the case that economic forecasts actually don't have a very good record because we actually don't know the dynamics of the future? And if you want an example, take China. Any economic forecast about China's prospects in 1987 would have been proved 100% incorrect because there wasn't a full understanding of the dynamics that were taking place inside China with the Deng Xiaoping changes to the way it was going to operate. So don't you think that sometimes you might be wrong in making the assumption that the United Kingdom as a Brexit standalone country would actually automatically be in a negative position over the next 10 years?
And just before you come in there, can I just say that I think there's a strong case for an independent Scotland to have a subsequent referendum on its relationship with the EU and the options that are open to it. The SNP are absolutely set on independence, meaning EU membership. The two have been tangled together, which I think was your doing, Jim, was it not, initially, way back in the day?
Right. That was in 1988.
Yes.
Before Maastricht and before the Lisbon Treaty. That changed everything.
Right, okay. Sorry, anyway, Anand.
I mean, what I would say to start my answer is, if in 1987 an economist had said, whatever happens to the Chinese economy going forward, and there's so much uncertainty we don't know what happens to the Chinese economy going forward, if they dramatically cut their international trade, their growth will be lower than it would have been if they hadn't, that economist would be right. And that's what's being said by the forecasts about Brexit and the UK economy. No one is saying the UK economy is going to shrink. No one is saying the UK economy is not capable of significant and sustained growth. What people are saying is, absent the trade with the European Union, which geography dictates is not going to be made up for with trade anywhere else, that growth will not be as fast as it would have been had that trade been kept in place. So yes, the UK economy can keep going well. There is a degree to which Brexit will enable us to make choices that we couldn't otherwise have made. Now, I can't think of many areas where those choices are going to be massively impactful in terms of aggregate economics, but they could be impactful in terms of how we manage agriculture in this country, how we manage environmental questions related to agriculture in this question. So there are public policy benefits to be had, even if they're not to be had in aggregate economic terms. And the crucial thing about economics is all the economic forecasts I've been talking about, again, in terms of aggregate economics. One of the things that might well happen as a result of Brexit, and has happened already in debate, and we have to see if it happens in practice, is our focus has shifted towards intra-UK inequalities. And we have a focus on that now to an extent we simply didn't have before the referendum. And I wouldn't be surprised if sort of in 10 years' time we look at an economy, and I still maintain the forecasts are probably right, it would be smaller than it would have been within the single market and the customs union, but where levels of inter-regional inequality are lower than they would have been had we not had the referendum and the political sea change that came out of it. He's disappeared, so I can't see if he's shaking his head.
No, he's not. No, he's nodding, in fact. Thank you, Jim. Well, listen, that brings us to the end of our time. Anand, thanks so much for that. That was absolutely fascinating. No questions avoided. You didn't get yourself into trouble as far as I can tell, although that remains to be seen. But we're immensely grateful for you giving us your time, and thanks also to the audience for your time and questions. I'll just say that our next event on the 23rd is with Anas Sarwar, the new leader of the Scottish Labour Party, which should be interesting. I don't think we're going to have another one before then, but keep an eye on your inbox just in case that changes. Are you on Question Time on Thursday, Anand?
No.
Oh dear.
Okay. You'd be able to tell by Question Time ruins my life. So for about 24 hours beforehand, I'm a gibbering wreck, and for about 48 hours afterwards, I can't calm down.
Well, there's always next week, so we'll keep an eye out for you. Well, best of luck, Anand, and thank you again for your time.
Thank you for the invite.
Everyone.
Nice to see you all.
Cheers.
Take care.